Chapter 1. Captain Wren's Crash and Burn. It was the perfect afternoon in early May, and Rhen Matthews was pedaling her way back home with a huge grin on her face. She'd just finished the last of her finals for the spring semester, not doing quite as well as she'd hoped she would, but still passing, and was now very much looking forward to spending the next 3 weeks sleeping in and not having to stress about keeping up with homework or making it to lectures on time for a change. God, it feels good to finally be done. Pushing herself up into a standing position on her pedals, the petite junior gave her arms and back a much-needed stretch as she coasted along an empty stretch of road. She'd just spent the last 2 hours hunched over a Scantron sheet in her university's exam hall, and all she wanted to do now was bask in her newfound freedom and the simple pleasure that came from riding her bike on a quiet afternoon. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and there was even a cool breeze blowing through the trees around her that whipped her dark ponytail and the tassels on her handlebars back behind her as she flew through the quiet neighborhood where she lived with her partner and no-nonsense disciplinarian, Dana Johnson. Oh, man, we should totally go out for dinner tonight, she thought to herself with a spike of excitement as she cut across a jogging path and back down onto the street. It's been way too long since we went anywhere fun. Reaching the top of the steep hill that marked the last couple of blocks on her journey home, Rhen beamed to herself and started pedaling as fast as she could. After a few hard pumps to get herself moving, she shifted into high gear and closed her eyes, allowing gravity to take over from there as her imagination took flight. Vroom! Here comes Captain Wren! As she hurtled forward down the hill, feeling her front tires starting to wobble as her speed continued to build at a slightly alarming rate, she swallowed her fear and forced herself to keep her eyes shut tight. Reveling in the spike of adrenaline that came as a result, she felt the boring sidewalks and houses of the suburbs around her fall away, being replaced instead by the cockpit of an advanced space fighter that she was maneuvering through enemy territory, a pair of plasma missiles hot on her heels. Nice try, you Federation scum, she smirked, picturing herself performing a daring aerial maneuver with all of the accompanying sound effects as she avoided the incoming attack. But you'll have to do a lot better than that if you plan on capturing me. At first, these impromptu space battles had terrified Rhen. Riding with your eyes closed was apt to do that, after all. But over the course of the last few weeks, she'd found herself growing more and more bold as she'd gotten used to navigating blind. And, feeling particularly daring that afternoon, she decided to let go of her handlebars entirely, forming twin finger guns that she used to shoot down her pursuing attackers. Pew, pew! Take that! You'll never defeat the Ancillary Alliance, Admiral Sloan. Pew! This bout of intergalactic heroism lasted for all but a moment, however. She wasn't actually that reckless. Not to mention she could feel her bike rapidly slipping out of her control. And as she once again took hold of her handlebars, she decided to crack one eye open just to make sure that she was still on course for home base. Which was exactly the moment when she noticed her neighbor pulling into her driveway just a few yards in front of her. Oh, crap! On instinct, Rhen squeezed the brake lever on her handlebars just as hard as she could, hoping against hope to avoid a head-on collision with the side of the silver car closing in on her way faster than she was comfortable with. But rather than engage her inertial dampeners like such a move might in the books she read, it instead just proved to be the final bad decision in a long list of them she'd been making over the course of the last minute. Crap, crap, crap! Watch out! Screech! as her front tire came to a sudden stop, squealing loudly in protest against the asphalt beneath it and leaving one heck of a skid mark in its passing. She lost control of her bike entirely. Veering sharply to her left, she hit the curb with a sickening crunch that halted her forward momentum all at once and sent her flying headfirst over the top of her handlebars as her back tire kicked up like a bucking bronco. From there, the next few moments passed by in a terrifying, bone-rattling blur. By some small miracle of fate in that split second before she was sent flying, Rhen managed to at least angle herself in the general direction of her neighbor's front yard, rather than her unforgiving concrete driveway. However, that didn't do anything to prevent her arms and legs from getting scraped to high heaven by protruding roots and the occasional loose stone as she tumbled head over heels across the grass. Denim shorts and a cute t-shirt were hardly the most robust safety equipment in the world, and as she finally came to a stop, landing on her side with a heavy thump that knocked the wind out of her, it felt as if her poor right arm had very nearly just been wrenched right out of its socket. Oh! For several long, agonizing seconds after rolling over onto her back, head spinning and heart pounding like a jackhammer against her heaving chest, all she could manage to do was stare blankly up at the crystal-clear Iowa sky above her, while she moaned pitifully at the all-encompassing, stinging, throbbing, aching pain that was every inch of her body just then. And then the tears came. "Oh, God," she croaked, unable to articulate herself any more so than that as she began to sob in earnest. "Aunt Dana, help!" Had she been in a clearer frame of mind just then, Rhen might have laughed at having her first reaction to taking a major spill on her bike be her crying out for her tough but loving mommy-dommy. But just then such feats of self-reflection were entirely lost on her, and instead she simply allowed herself to be overtaken by the need to have a good, hard cry. "Blimey, child! What on earth were you thinking? What?" Blinking away tears, Wren's brows knitted together in momentary confusion as the silhouette of Mrs. Hastings, the retired Englishwoman whose car she just narrowly avoided plowing headfirst into, suddenly obscured the pounding glare of the sun above her head, looking equal parts terrified, relieved, and furious. "You could have broken your full neck zipping about like that." With a low groan and an audible popping of several joints, her elderly neighbor eased herself down onto the grass beside her and began gently prodding and poking at her bruised and battered frame in search of any major injuries or broken bones. "Well, everything seems to be still where it's supposed to be, so that's good," she eventually declared with a stoic frown. "Are you hurt anywhere I'm not seeing?" Suddenly feeling more than a little embarrassed about crying like a 5-year-old in front of the woman she waved hello to on her way to campus in the mornings, Rhen bit back on another sob as she dragged a dirty forearm across her eyes, sniffling in spite of herself as she tried to pull herself back together. "No, I think I'm okay," she groaned, pushing herself up onto her elbows and gasping at the sharp, stinging sensation that produced in them. "Kind of." "Easy now," admonished Mrs. Hastings gently, helping her the rest of the way up into a sitting position and busying herself with brushing away some of the stray bits of grass and dirt clinging to the back of her t-shirt. "You took quite the spill, you know." "Tell me about it," agreed Rhen, attempting to shrug the whole thing off with a rueful grimace, only to hiss in through clenched teeth and whimper as her shoulder gave an alarming twinge of pain and protest. "Oh, no. Oh, no, no, no. This will not do at all. Not at all." Clucking her tongue in worried disapproval, looking the very picture of a fretting mother hen, Mrs. Hastings shook her head and then pushed herself back up to her feet. Then, after brushing off the front of her skirt and knuckling some of the stiffness from her lower back, she leaned forward and hoisted her up after her, seizing her with a surprisingly strong grip under her armpits and hauling her up with only a slight grunt as she deposited her back onto her feet as if she were a small child. "Come along, love," she ordered then, draping an arm around her trim waist to avoid her shoulder and turning to half lead, half carry her toward the front of her house. "Let's get you inside and cleaned up, and then I'll ring your auntie to come collect you. I dare say you've had enough bicycling for one day." "Uh-huh." It wasn't a request, Rhen noted with some small amount of annoyance. But by then she was well used to people mistaking her short stature, petite frame, and youthful looks for those of a young teenager and bossing her around accordingly. So she didn't bother trying to assert herself. Besides, it wasn't like she had anything on her just then that would be able to back up her claims that she was actually a 20-year-old college student, even if she'd wanted to. Dana had seen to that long ago. Part of the stipulations for moving in with her partner the year before, when she'd been on the verge of being kicked out of the dorms on campus, had been that when the two of them were in public, she had to pretend to be the older woman's teenage niece from out of town, which meant handing over her ID, her debit cards, and anything else tied to her adult identity to her for safekeeping, just in case anybody started asking uncomfortable questions like, for instance, why a supposed adult was being put across someone's lap in the middle of public for a well-deserved spanking. And while it was certainly true that their romantic relationship had evolved and deepened since that fateful day last summer when her then boss had mistaken her for one of her disobedient charges who just refused to stand in the corner like she'd been told to, that hadn't done anything to lessen the other side of their dynamic in the slightest. Which, combined with the nauseatingly adorable outfits she insisted that she wear every day, and her own natural penchant for sass and disobedience, meant to the world at large she was indeed little Rennie Matthews, the precocious and headstrong 13-year-old living with her strict aunt while she went to school away from home. And she wouldn't have had it any other way. But even if that weren't the case and her neighbor knew exactly how old she really was, Rhen had to admit that she wasn't at all in the mood to argue with her just then. Her head was throbbing, her shoulder was aching, and the scrapes and scuffs all across her arms and legs stung like crazy. So, instead of pitching a fit and insisting that she could walk just fine all on her own, thank you very much, she allowed herself to be shepherded inside the neat and tidy Hastings residence, past the walls of smiling grandchildren and wedding photos, and into the equally neat and tidy kitchen at the other end of the house. "Right then, now you just sit your little body there," ordered the old woman in a brisk, motherly fashion as she deftly pulled a chair away from the table with one hand and turned it around to face the rest of the room, giving its seat a perfunctory pat. "And I'll be back in just a tick with some antiseptic for those cuts." Not seeing much choice other than to do as she'd been told, Rhen tamped down on the urge to roll her eyes and instead settled herself gingerly onto the proffered seat with a meek nod and a quiet, "Yes, ma'am," while her host disappeared off down the hall they'd just come from. Thankfully, by then her head was starting to clear up a bit, and the dull, all-over ache that she'd been experiencing ever since wiping out was easing somewhat as well. Though that didn't seem to be doing much for the sharp, stinging sensations still throbbing away in her elbows and knees, where she could see now she'd scraped them up quite a bit. "Geez, yikes," she said to herself with another wince, tearing her gaze away from her torn-up legs and casting it about the kitchen in search of something to distract herself with. Looking around, she couldn't help but feel the corners of her lips quirk up in a fond smile. Mrs. Hastings' kitchen was very much a reflection of the woman herself. Clean, meticulously tidy with everything in its proper place, and with a sense of style that was several decades out of date. Heck, she even had an honest-to-God rotary dial telephone mounted on a wall beside her back door. Holy cow! Talk about retro! Wren was just in the process of climbing back to her feet, wondering if it would be rude to start digging around in the freezer to make herself an ice pack for her aching shoulder, when the old woman came bustling back into the room. "I thought I told you to sit," she huffed, punctuating her question with a firm but gentle push against Wren's uninjured shoulder that sent her backside plopping back down onto her hard, wooden seat. "I was just—" the younger girl tried to explain, her voice coming out a lot whinier than she'd meant for it to, before being cut off by an admonishing finger wag from Mrs. Hastings. "None of that now, love," she said with a shake of her head. "You don't want those cuts to get infected, do you?" I guess not, ma'am," answered Wren, not bothering to hold back her eye roll this time. "Good," chirped her neighbor, ignoring the attitude she was giving her as she eased herself down onto her knees in front of her. "Right then, you just hold still and Nonna Hastings will have you right as rain in a jiffy." Blushing all over at the patronizing motherly tone Mrs. Hastings was using with her, Wren bit back on pointing out that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself, and instead did her best not to squirm too much as her neighbor pushed the legs of her shorts up her thighs and began wiping away the bits of dirt and grass still clinging to her scraped knees with a damp rag. "Now, this might sting a bit," she warned a few moments later as she soaked a cotton ball in something strong-smelling that she poured from a brown bottle with a worn label. Wren was just in the middle of reassuring her that she'd be fine when an involuntary yelp escaped her lips and she found herself springing up out of her seat as if it had just tried to bite her. "Ah! Hey! Watch it! Slap, slap!" "Oh, hush, you little turnip!" tissed Mrs. Hastings, giving the embroidered flowers adorning the tops of her thighs a couple light swats. "And hold still. It's just a tad of peroxide. You'll be fine. But if you keep squirming around like you've got ants in your pants, it's going to ruin these pretty shorts of yours." "But it stings." Wren found herself whining with a sullen pout, flopping back into her chair again and rubbing absently at her legs, while blushing even brighter at the childish way she'd been reprimanded and her equally childish reaction to it. "That just means it's working," the other woman reassured her with a gentle smile. "If you say so." Continuing to pout at her neighbor while she worked, Gren rumbled under her breath about everything and nothing in particular as she watched her finish applying the stinging antiseptic to her scrapes, before then spreading a generous amount of antibiotic ointment across each of them, followed by a bright pink Band-Aid to keep them clean. Try as she might to focus on being indignant, however, she found that she just couldn't keep it up for very long. There was something about the retired woman's wry but friendly demeanor as she kept up a running commentary on how silly she'd been and how glad she was that she hadn't been hurt too badly, that soon had her smiling right along with her, despite how embarrassing it was to be treated like a little girl who'd hurt herself while playing in the yard. "Well, I can see now that cheeky attitude of yours is doing just fine," observed Mrs. Hastings with a low chuckle, her tone admonishing while her eyes remained teasing. "I'd say that's a fairly good sign that you're well on your way to a full recovery, wouldn't you?" "Yeah," agreed Wren with a chuckle of her own. By the time her neighbor finished cleaning her up and covering the rest of her scrapes in seemingly half a box's worth of Band-Aids, she'd all but forgotten about her sour mood and instead was simply grateful that she'd come away from her accident with so few injuries. Well, other than the sharp twinge of pain her right shoulder produced whenever she tried to move it too much. That was definitely more than a little concerning. But since she could move it at all, she figured that it was probably fine. Hopefully. "There we are," cooed Mrs. Hastings, patting the top of Wren's left thigh with a warm smile before using her for support as she levered herself back to her feet. "All better?" "More or less," agreed the younger girl with a chagrined smirk. "Thanks, Mrs. Hastings. I owe you one." "Oh, never you mind," replied the other woman with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Taking care of each other is what good neighbors do. Now, you just stay put while I put the kettle on. I dare say you could use a pick-me-up after all that." Truth be told, Wren had been hoping that she could just slip out the back door and limp her way home as soon as the other woman had finished patching her up. But by the time the last Band-Aid had been applied, a heavy weight of fatigue had settled down around her, and anything that delayed having to make the 2.5-block walk home, there was no way she was getting back on her bike that afternoon, assuming it was even still rideable, came as a huge relief. "Tea or cocoa?" prompted Mrs. Hastings, pulling her thoughts back to the present as she held up a pair of decorative tin containers. Replied Wren with a frown. "Do you have any coffee?" A shot of caffeine sounded really nice right about then. "Not for little ones like you, I don't," replied the other woman with a disapproving shake of her head, her lips tightening at the corners as she repeated herself with a bit more steel in her voice this time. "Tea or cocoa?" "Cocoa is fine, thanks," squeaked Wren with a blush. She hadn't meant to reply quite so quickly or quite so nervously, but there was something about the look Mrs. Hastings was giving her just then that had the words tumbling out of her mouth before she could stop them. Ma'am?" "There's a good lass." Despite the offer of a hot beverage and her neighbor's motherly smile at her response, however, Wren was still far from being out of the woods just yet. As Mrs. Hastings set about retrieving a shiny metal kettle from a cabinet above a truly antique-looking microwave and filling it with water from the sink, she began to give her an earful and a half about how totally irresponsible she'd been while she went through the motions of making their drinks, her movements clearly second nature to her by now after decades of practice. "You could have been hit by a car or cracked your damn head open, you silly girl," she huffed, sounding more worried than actually angry as she banged her kettle down onto one of the stove burners with more force than was strictly necessary. "There's absolutely no excuse for it whatsoever. No excuse. You're just lucky that you were able to tumble onto my lawn like you did. I can't imagine what might have happened had someone hit you while they were coming up the street." Wren opened her mouth to argue, more so out of habit than because she actually felt the woman was wrong. But the only thing that she could think of to say just then was that technically it was she who had hit a car, not the other way around. Which, given the way Mrs. Hastings was muttering under her breath about irresponsible and disobedient kids these days, probably wouldn't have gone over very well. So instead, she wisely chose to keep her mouth shut and simply nodded along with her lecture. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, ma'am." Mrs. Hastings was having none of it, though, and rounded on her with a glare hard enough to cut through diamonds as she pressed the attack. "I should hope so, young lady," she growled, her nostrils flaring as her lips drew down into a hard, thin line. "What would your auntie say if she knew that you were riding around like some sort of crazed maniac with your eyes closed like that, Oh, yes, my girl. Don't think I didn't happen to notice that particular bit of foolishness. It was clear that her neighbor was working up a head of steam just as her kettle started doing much the same, and Wren was at a loss for what to say next. I wasn't, I mean, and not even wearing a helmet! She fumed with a disbelieving scoff, steamrolling over her feeble attempts at an excuse before she could make one as she took half a step forward and jabbed an angry forefinger at her. What on earth were you thinking, girl? What if you'd really gotten yourself hurt? You could have been killed! Now, that shut Wren up in a hurry. Staring forlornly down at the dirt and grass-stained tops of her shorts, she deflated and just nodded while doing her best to hold back the tide of tears that were suddenly threatening to overwhelm her. I guess I wasn't really, she started to croak, her voice and lips quavering as a single fat tear trickled its way down the side of her cheek. She tried to wipe it away, but that just seemed to make things worse, and soon 2 more were there to replace it. Really thinking about... Seeing that she'd thoroughly made her point, Mrs. Hastings let out a long sigh and shook her head in exasperation. There, child, she soothed, closing the distance between the two of them and leaning down to wrap her in a warm embrace. That's all in the past now. You're safe, and that's all that matters. Grateful for the physical contact just then, the reality of how close she'd come to seriously injuring herself, or worse, hitting her way harder than she'd hit the ground, Wren let the last of her dignity go for the moment as she clung to Mrs. Hastings and sobbed her heart out, soaking the front of her blouse with tears. The old woman, for her part, simply continued to cradle her against her chest while she cried, rubbing her back and murmuring gentle words of encouragement against the top of her head until she'd at last calmed down enough to get herself back under control, letting go of her only when the kettle on the stovetop finally started to whistle. Cheer up now, sunshine, ordered Mrs. Hastings with a gentle tisk as she bustled her way back over to the stove and moved the kettle off of its burner. A spot of cocoa and a couple ibuprofen for those bumps and bruises ought to have you feeling better in no time. God, that does sound nice right about now, agreed Wren as she wiped away the remaining moisture from her cheeks with the backs of her hands, inadvertently smearing them with dirt in the process. She sniffled again, and then flashed the other woman a watery smile as she watched her set about pouring their drinks. Language, young lady, chided Mrs. Hastings, almost as an afterthought, not bothering to look back at her as she scooped dark brown cocoa powder into a blue ceramic mug, followed by a handful of tiny marshmallows, before pouring some of the water from the kettle on top of it all and giving it a quick stir. Sorry, apologized Wren, blushing faintly as she accepted the warm mug with both hands, blowing on its steaming contents before taking a tentative sip. Oh, this is yummy. I thought you might say that, smirked the older woman as she turned back to the counter, poured water into her own mug, and began to dip a tea bag into it. Now then, you just sit tight and nurse that while I ring up your auntie, all right? Hearing that, Wren's stomach lurched, and she very nearly choked on the sip of cocoa she'd just been in the middle of taking. She'd completely forgotten that her neighbor was planning on calling her partner. Oh, crap! If Mrs. Hastings' reactions to her two-wheeled daredevil antics were anything to go by, her Auntie Dana was going to be absolutely pissed. Do you really have to do that, ma'am? She asked, bringing her most endearing smile to bear. "Why, whatever do you mean, child?" Turning back to face her with a confused look, Mrs. Hastings set her mug aside to let it steep. "Of course I have to call her. I can't have her wondering why her niece is coming home looking like she just got back from a trip to the ER. I mean, I guess that's true," conceded Rhen with a reluctant grimace, trying desperately to think of some way that she could possibly spin things so as to keep this just between the two of them, and drawing a blank. It's just that, rather than elaborate further and embarrass herself, she instead made a vague gesture in the air with one of her hands. You know, that seemed to be clear enough for Mrs. Hastings, though, whose eyes lit up with understanding as her lips quirked into something approaching a sympathetic smile. "Yes, I do imagine that you're in for quite the sore body when you get home," she agreed with a sage nod, not sounding sorry for her in the slightest. "From what I've seen, peeking in through that big window your aunt likes to leave the curtains drawn back on whenever I take my walks around the neighborhood at night, she tends to keep you on a rather short leash, doesn't she?" It wasn't really a question, Wren knew, especially not if Mrs. Hastings had already seen her standing there in the corner of her and her partner's front room with a freshly spanked bare bottom on full display, as was so often the case for her, and the sudden strawberry flush in her cheeks, not to mention her inability to meet the other woman's gaze, all but confirmed it for her if there was any lingering doubt. "Well, good," sniffed Mrs. Hastings, deftly plucking her tea bag out of her mug and tossing it into a nearby trash can with a sharp flick of her wrist. "After the way you've been behaving today, I dare say a damn good hiding is exactly what's needed to sort you out." Agree to disagree, thanks." Huffing at her neighbor's smug satisfaction, Wren directed her attention back to her mug of cocoa and took a nice, long, and intentionally loud sip to distract herself. It was hard to keep pouting, though, when the stupid stuff tasted so dang good. "Well, I guess it has been a few weeks since I actually had to sleep on my stomach," she mused to herself with another half-hearted harumph. Oh well, it was a good run while it lasted. Seeing that she'd made her point for the time being, Mrs. Hastings took an experimental sip of her tea, nodded to herself, and then stalked purposefully over to her wall-mounted telephone. Cradling its handset against her shoulder and dialing with her free hand while her other continued to hold her tea, she waited patiently for the call to go through, which it did, after only a handful of rings. "Hello, Dana?" "Yes, this is Olivia from down the way. How are you?" Wren continued to scowl into her mug while doing her best to eavesdrop on the conversation happening just a few feet away from her, unable to help but notice the distinct difference in tone her elderly neighbor used while talking with her aunt compared to with her. Stupid double standards. "Oh, I'm fine. I've got Wren over here, actually." She paused then while Dana replied, balefully eyeing her over the steaming rim of her mug with a very "you've got nobody to blame for this but yourself" kind of look before continuing. "No, she's all right, but it was a rather close call, that." Continuing to maintain a disapproving frown in her direction, she gradually began to fill her adoptive auntie in on all that had happened in the last half hour or so, framing her tale of downhill daring against the evil forces of the Federation in the most unflattering light possible, as she painted an uncomfortably detailed picture of a very bratty teen who'd been acting completely irresponsibly. Unfortunately for her, though, none of what she said was in any way a fabrication, and as much as it irked her to admit it, Rhen was hard-pressed to deny that she had messed up pretty badly, which only made the sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach that much worse. And then Mrs. Hastings got to the part about her not wearing a helmet. She what? Wincing, able to actually hear Dana's shrill and tinny squawk of disbelief blaring out from the worn Bakelite handset, Rhen ducked her head to hide behind her bangs. Uh-oh, that's definitely not a good sign. I know, it's completely beyond the pale, agreed Mrs. Hastings with the fervent nod of one outraged caregiver to another. Could have cracked her silly head right open, she could have. Oh, God. The thoroughly mortified 20-year-old turned teenager moaned to herself, sinking down in her seat with a self-pitying roll of her eyes. I am so very, very screwed. Why didn't I just wear that freaking helmet she bought me? Well, because it was bright pink and sparkly enough to make sure that not a single person could miss her coming, obviously. But looking back on things now, and her near miss with serious head trauma, that suddenly seemed like a pretty dumb reason to needlessly put herself in danger. Dang it. I really stepped into it this time, didn't I? Snorting as a morbid grin tugged up on the corners of her lips, Rhen took a pouty pull from her cocoa. Well, more like launched myself head first into it. Humph! The two older women continued to chat amiably for a while longer after that, apparently not in any particular rush to get off the phone, even with her near-constant glowering and silent pleas for them to do so. Eventually, though, Mrs. Hastings finally hung up after a cordial, Of course. I don't mind in the slightest, love. I'll keep her snug as a bug until you can get round to collect her. Uh-huh. Oh, I have just the thing for that, don't you worry. Right. I was planning on doing just that. So I'm glad we're in agreement there. All right, then. Cheers. Jeez, took you long enough. Well, now, her neighbor said after taking a moment to enjoy a prolonged sip of her tea, savoring its taste and aroma before setting it aside on the counter with a light clack of ceramic on tile as she turned to face Rhen with her hands planted firmly on her hips. I think it's fairly safe to say that you're in for quite the smacked bottom when your auntie gets hold of you, my dear. Is that right? Deadpanned Rhen as she drained the last vestiges of lukewarm cocoa from the bottom of her mug and scowled. I'm shocked. Quite, sniffed Mrs. Hastings, either not picking up on her sarcasm or else choosing to ignore it as she continued. But, on the bright side, you're at least safe from her wrath for the time being. Unable to stop herself from perking up just a little bit at this unexpected good news, Rhen asked, I am? She'd honestly been expecting Dana to come storming over just as soon as she'd hung up, if not sooner. Indeed you are, nodded her neighbor with a faint chuckle, gathering up her tea for another sip and continuing to act as if they were discussing the weather rather than her impending doom across her irate partner's knee. She's still tied up with her daycare duties and has asked me to keep an eye on you until she can come collect you later this evening. Phew, sighed Rhen with an over-exaggerated swipe of her hand across her brow, deciding that since getting a spanking from Dana was already a foregone conclusion that she might as well make the best of an unpleasant situation by injecting a little levity into the mix. I guess that means I'll still be able to sit down for dinner, at least. Well, not exactly, corrected Mrs. Hastings with a rather insincere-looking apologetic frown, heading off her next question before she could ask it. "You see, in addition to keeping an eye on you, she also asked me to, and I quote, warm her bready butt up something fierce." "She what?" demanded Rhen, mirroring her partner's own righteous indignation from earlier as she sat up, stock straight in her chair, all of the color draining from her face at once through the hole that had just opened up in the pit of her stomach. "I believe you heard me just fine, young lady," answered Mrs. Hastings coolly, not sounding the least bit sympathetic. "And I don't mind saying that she and I are in complete agreement there." But, spluttering nervously, unable to think of anything more articulate to say than that just then, as a fresh spike of anxiety gnawed away at her insides, Rhen racked her brain for something to dissuade the older woman from making good on her aunt's request without humiliating herself further by trying to explain just why it was she felt she was too old for what was about to happen next. Only to come up woefully empty. "Oh my God, I seriously can't believe this is happening." Although she'd definitely been spanked by people other than her bossy boots not aunt over the course of the last year since she'd started living with her, Dana had never actually delegated the task out to anybody before. Well, not counting her Aunt Maureen, that is. And the idea that she might ever do so had never even crossed her mind. Though, in retrospect, it really probably should have. "We prefer to use the word bottom where I come from, dear," replied Mrs. Hastings evenly, clearly delighting in the sudden change in attitude her announcement had wrought in her sassy houseguest. "But yes, that is indeed where I intend on chastising you for your reckless behavior in just a moment." "Of course it is," grumbled Rhen, snatching up her empty mug from the table beside her and pretending to take another sip from it in a flimsy attempt to hide the rising blush in her cheeks as she continued to grumble sourly into its ceramic confines. "This is freaking so not fair." "Pardon me, young lady," snapped Mrs. Hastings, sounding more cross than Rhen had yet heard her as she took a step forward with a stormy glare that instantly had her insides churning with frantic worry. "You're not arguing with me now, are you?" "No, ma'am," she squeaked on reflex. Mrs. Hastings definitely wasn't someone that she wanted to be upset with her, especially not when she was about to spank her. She actually liked the old woman quite a bit, and not just because she sometimes gave her freshly baked cookies to take home when she was on her way back from classes in the afternoon. Rhen could tell that she was a bit lonely living by herself ever since her husband had passed away a few years earlier, and with most of her grandkids living out of state, or in some cases out of the country entirely, the young co-ed suspected that she'd become something of a surrogate grandchild to the retired widow. And the idea that she'd disappointed her made her feel about 2 inches tall just then. "You'd best mind yourself, young lady," huffed the older woman with a sharp cluck of her tongue, once again planting her hands on her hips as she glared down at her, the silver in her brown hair lending her voice an implacable edge of authority. "We'll have none of that sour attitude in my house. Thank you very much." "Yes, ma'am." Ugh, this is so freaking typical. Rhen had been hoping that her neighbor might show at least some amount of hesitation about putting her across her knee, but clearly that wasn't going to be the case. And really, she asked herself with an internal put-upon sigh, why should it be? Mrs. Hastings had already made it humiliatingly clear that she knew exactly how her aunt went about dealing with her disobedience. And she approved. Whatever, it's probably just because she's from England or something. Rhen tried to tell herself, ignoring for the moment that pretty much every adult that she'd had a run-in with thus far while in her Rennie persona, and even a few from before she'd moved in with Dana, had tended to treat her in much the same way. They're all stuck in the Stone Age over there. I mean, come on. They drive on the left side of the road, for crying out loud. Of course she's going to think I need a spanking for accidentally crashing into her car just because I was riding around with my eyes closed. Humph. Oh, don't look so glum, you frowny Frida, her neighbor admonished with a thin smile, completely unfazed by her pouting and grumbling as she closed the distance between the two of them and gave her pushed-out cheek an affectionate pinch. It's just a little smacked bottom. I know you're well used to those by now. Rhen, at least, had the good grace not to try and deny that fact. Instead, just letting out another harumph and doing her very best not to crack so much as a half grin at her neighbor's charming affability. It didn't work. And besides, she continued, letting go of her cheek and gently but very firmly guiding her back to her feet with an insistent grip on her upper arm, I don't think you can truly say that you haven't earned one by now, can you? She fixed Rhen in place with an expectant look then, waiting for her to reply, and after putting it off for as long as she could by glaring at the faded wallpaper behind her neighbor's right shoulder, she finally sighed in defeat. No, ma'am, you're right, she admitted with a roll of her eyes, only managing to sound marginally contrite. I guess. Quick as a striking snake, Mrs. Hastings' thumb and forefinger shot out and seized hold of her left ear in a vice-like grip. Ack! The younger girl yelped, automatically shooting up onto her tiptoes to try and ease some of the pressure being applied to her ear. Don't you dare roll your eyes at me, young lady, snapped Mrs. Hastings, ignoring her protests as she tightened her grip on her ear and gave it a sharp twist that had her dancing around the kitchen in a frantic circle. I have been exceedingly patient with you thus far on account of your injuries, but I will not tolerate any more of your impertinence. Is that understood? Okay, hissed Rhen through clenched teeth, her eyes starting to tear up at the corners as she was drawn in close enough to be practically touching noses with her incensed neighbor. What was that? Eep! She squeaked, knees going weak as she quickly corrected herself. I mean, yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, ma'am. I should certainly hope so. You naughty thing. Nodding to herself with the sort of grim determination that Rhen knew from all too much personal experience did not bode well for her backside, Mrs. Hastings drew back her shoulders and began marching her out of the kitchen. Now, you just come with me to the sitting room, she ordered, not actually giving her a choice in the matter as she dragged her along by the ear. A thorough dose of Nana Hastings' slipper ought to set some of that attitude of yours to right, I suspect. Oh, owie! I'm coming, jeez! The next thing she knew, Rhen found herself being pushed face first over the side of a floral print couch, grunting in protest a moment later as her hips were hoisted up into place across the top of its elevated scroll arm, lifting her feet off of the floor entirely in the process. Thankfully, though, with this new position, there at least came a blessed release of her throbbing ear. That was of little comfort just then, however, once she felt Mrs. Hastings pushing down on the small of her back with her left hand, while the fingers of her right took hold of the stretchy, easy pull elastic waistband of her denim shorts. Let's just get a look at those knickers then, shall we? Wait, no, come on, Rhen whined, squirming like an eel as her neighbor began wrestling her shorts down off her narrow hips. Can't we just do it over my shorts, please? Don't be ridiculous, child, scoffed Mrs. Hastings, shaking her head in mild exasperation before at last managing to work her dirt and grass-stained shorts to her knees, letting gravity take hold of them from there to pull them the rest of the way down into a crumpled heap on the floor behind her. Smack, smack! And stop all that wriggling nonsense this instant, she added sharply, delivering 2 brisk swats to the cartoon dinosaurs printed across the taut seat of the absolutely adorable pair of pastel pink panties she'd just exposed. Unlike the rest of Wren's rather childish-looking wardrobe, they had been specifically handpicked by her partner because not only did they reinforce her image as a young and bratty teen who thought she was way more grown up than she actually was to anyone who happened to see them, which was proving to be a distressingly high number of people in her experience since moving in with her, but also because they looked even cuter when they were being pulled down for a spanking. "Ow! Hey!" she protested with a petulant huff, back arching and ankles scissoring behind her as twin blossoms of stinging heat suddenly bloomed across the centers of her cheeks. "I'm sorry, okay? Jeez!" "Yes, dear, I'm sure you are," agreed Mrs. Hastings dryly, not sounding particularly convinced as she took hold of the waistband of her panties and whisked them, too, down to her knees with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent several decades correcting the bad behavior of bratty adolescence. "Ah, much better." Eep! Her entire body going as rigid as if she'd just been struck by lightning, it always came as a bit of a shock to her how easily her panties seemed to come down when she was in trouble. Wren melted back across the arm of her neighbor's couch with a reluctant sigh of defeat. She'd had a feeling that Mrs. Hastings wasn't someone who spanked on anything other than a bare bottom, and much to her own annoyance, she'd been right. Ugh. And now that she was lying there, ready and waiting to be disciplined, it seemed depressingly likely, too, that her elderly neighbor was going to prove to be a very thorough spanker, which was a thought that did absolutely nothing to ease the swarm of butterflies roiling around inside her stomach just then. This sucks. "Now then, you just stay right there while I go and fetch my slipper," ordered the clearly amused older woman, not sounding out of breath in the slightest after the ordeal of wrestling her shorts and panties down for her. "It's been a while since I've had to put it to use, but I think I still remember where I tucked it last." "Fine," grumbled Wren sullenly into the couch cushion in front of her, flexing her toes nervously behind her and wishing suddenly that she'd just been taken over the other woman's lap for an immediate hand spanking instead. She absolutely hated having to wait around for her punishment to begin, especially like this. The sooner it was over and done with, the better, as far as she was concerned. "There's a good lass," chirped Mrs. Hastings with a perfunctory pat across the center of her arched and semi-parted cheeks, before adding sternly, "Oh, and don't you dare move a muscle until I've returned, or else there will be consequences. Is that understood?" "It's not like I can really go anywhere, you know," the thoroughly embarrassed junior pointed out with a put-upon huff. "I mean it, girl," Mrs. Hastings pressed. "If I have to chase you down to get you to take your punishment, you are going to regret it. Believe you me." Though part of her bristled at the implication that she'd be so childish as to try and actually run away from her impending spanking at this point in the process, the steel with which her neighbor delivered that warning still managed to send a nervous shiver coursing through Wren, making goosebumps sprout up all across where her cheeks had just been patted. "Yes, ma'am?" She all but yelped, doing her best to try and get more comfortable across her rounded-over perch, her cheeks clenching and unclenching behind her as she turned her head to look up pleadingly at her frowning neighbor. "I'll be good, I promise." "We'll just see about that, now won't we?" drawled Mrs. Hastings, cocking one brow as if to say that she very much doubted they would. A look which earned her a mighty harumph from Rhen. "I'll be back in a minute, dear," she repeated with an amused snort, her stern demeanor slipping somewhat as she smiled fondly back at the supposedly 13-year-old girl laid out across the arm of her couch, before turning on her heel and moving off down a hallway toward what Rhen could only assume was the house's master bedroom. Once the old woman's back was safely turned to her, she stuck out her tongue and blew a silent raspberry at her retreating form, fully embracing her bratty nature now that there was absolutely no chance of her being able to avoid the much-deserved spanking she had coming. Then again, she mused to herself with a pensive frown, planting her left elbow on the couch cushion in front of her and propping her chin on her palm as she tried once again to wriggle her hips into a position that didn't press so insistently on her bladder without the benefit of actually being able to use her feet to do so. She did say that she was going to get her slipper. Despite the butterflies swirling around inside her stomach and the embarrassed blush warming her face as cool air pumped in by the house's air conditioning tickled her sit spots and the crevice between her bare cheeks, Rhen couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope kindling within her chest. Like, seriously, how bad could a spanking from some dumb, old, stupid, fuzzy pink bunny slipper actually be anyway? She asked aloud to the empty room, squirming anew at the naughty thrill that this act of quiet rebellion sent tingling across her partially exposed vulva and up to her clit, making it twinge in a decidedly unrepentant way as she tried to imagine how she must look just then. Besides, she's probably about as old as Grandma is, so I doubt she could even spank all that hard anymore. Never mind the fact that she'd just learned firsthand last Thanksgiving that her grandma was more than capable of making her howl with just a hand spanking when she set her mind to it. Heck, even if she is doing it on the bear, getting spanked with a smushy slipper can't possibly hurt that much, right? She reasoned, losing her nerve to continue speaking aloud as she heard her neighbor moving things around in another room. I'll just put on a good show, yelp and cry a bit, maybe even squeeze out a tear or two if I can, and then it'll all be over and I'll be back to sipping more of that tasty cocoa. Feeling better and better about her current predicament with each passing moment, aside from the fact that she was still lying face down with her bare bottom on full display and about to be spanked, Rhen hummed happily to herself as she idly bobbed her tennis shoe-covered feet back and forth behind her in time with her nameless tune. Aunt Dana is definitely not going to be a picnic later on tonight, but at least this part won't be so bad. Rhen couldn't help but shiver again as she tried to decide whether she was more likely to receive her comeuppance from her partner with the trusty ebony hairbrush that they kept on the nightstand beside her bed at all times, or the thick leather belt that her grandma had so thoughtfully given her as a Christmas present a few months back. Either way, it was definitely going to suck. "Right then," announced Mrs. Hastings a few minutes later, abruptly startling her out of her quiet contemplation of the old woman's antique-looking television set and her musings about whether or not she had cable, as she strode briskly back into the neatly furnished living room and over to the couch with what appeared to be some sort of dark gray shoe gripped firmly in her right hand. "That's enough dilly-dallying. Let's get down to business, shall we?" "Right," echoed Rhen with a nod, unsure of what else to say just then, but feeling the need to at least say something as her neighbor appraised her naked cheeks with a thoughtful expression. "Down to business." Mrs. Hastings gave her a slight smile at that, but otherwise didn't acknowledge her reply as she went on to say, "I think we'll have 2 dozen for your reckless bicycling." And let's see now. She paused for a moment then, lightly rapping her slipper against the side of her leg as she mulled the question over in her mind. Another dozen for all that cheek you've been giving me. Yes, that ought to be enough to get you to sit up and take notice. I guess that's fair, agreed Rhen with a faint blush, doing her best to not let on how relieved she was to hear that she'd only have to deal with 36 swats from the old woman's flimsy bedroom slipper. Jeez, I could do that in my sleep. She snickered to herself under her breath. What was that, young lady? Prompted Mrs. Hastings, demonstrating that she had far better hearing than the petite junior gave her credit for as she stepped in right beside her left hip to loom over her with the menacing air of a grandmother whose patience had just run out. Nothing, ma'am, Rhen assured her quickly, doing a terrible job of sounding contrite just then as she fought down a nervous giggle. This was almost too easy. Yes, I'm sure. Still sounding less than convinced, Mrs. Hastings lined up her slipper for her first swat, giving Wren's bare right cheek a couple of experimental pats with its flexible rubber sole as she got a feel for her aim. That feels a bit, heavier than I was imagining it would, she couldn't help but notice, doing her best to try and angle her head to the side without drawing the other woman's attention so that she could steal a glance at the thing in her hand. Wait, hold on, what's that? She started to ask. Thwop, thwop! Only to have her words cut off by a strangled yelp as two back-to-back and shockingly harsh smacks from the sole of the thing gripped in Mrs. Hastings' right hand exploded across the centers of her upturned buns. Thwop, thwop! Followed by two more against either of her sit spots. Holy crap! Squirming in place beneath the old woman's firm grip on her lower back and flailing her legs back and forth behind her as she hissed out several, thankfully unintelligible curse words through clenched teeth, Rhen threw an accusatory glare over her shoulder and demanded indignantly, "What the heck was that?" "Why, it was my slipper, of course," answered Mrs. Hastings, sounding more than a little confused as she hefted the implement in question up high enough for her to get a proper look at. Narrowing her eyes at the thing in her neighbor's right hand, Rhen scowled. Whatever it was, it definitely was not a fuzzy pink bunny slipper, that was for sure. For starters, it had laces. Not to mention a thick rubber sole with zigzag grooves and a canvas body. If anything, it looked more like one of the high tops she was currently wearing, albeit about half a dozen sizes bigger than anything that she might conceivably wear. But, she spluttered, unsure of how else to articulate her confusion without giving away the fact that she'd been expecting something far less effective when her neighbor had said that she was going to fetch her slipper. "Oh, I think I see the problem here," laughed Mrs. Hastings as she continued to splutter and stare, seeming to catch on to what was throwing her off, though hopefully not its exact nature. "I always forget that you Americans call these something else over here. No, what was it again? Trainers? No, that's not it either. She flashed Rhen an apologetic smile and waved the shoe in her hand in a lazy arc beside her as she searched for the right word. "Tennis shoes?" suggested Rhen with a sullen pout, not finding this whole linguistic misunderstanding nearly as amusing as her neighbor was. "Thwop! Owie! Ah, yes, that's the ticket," declared Mrs. Hastings brightly, bringing the well-worn tennis shoe back down against the middle of her cheeks hard enough to make her squeak and toss her frazzled ponytail to and fro behind her as she beat out a staccato rhythm against the cushion in front of her with clenched fists. "Oh, my God! That thing stings!" she whined, blowing several strands of loose hair out of her face as the slipper's initial sharp bite gradually gave way to a more generalized burning sensation deeper in her scalded seat. "Yes, well, that is rather the point, my dear," agreed Mrs. Hastings, not sounding the least bit sympathetic as she rubbed first one and then the other of her bare, wobbly cheeks, seemingly trying to decide which one she'd swat next. "It wouldn't be much of a punishment otherwise, now would it? Thwop, 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 thwop." As if to underscore just exactly what she meant, the old woman delivered half a dozen hard and unforgiving swats in just as many seconds, stoking the lingering heat in Wren's cheeks into a raging inferno as she set her bottom to bouncing and her legs to kicking. "Ugh! Ack!" she grunted, doing her very best to try and ride out the storm of slipper smacks, and just barely managing to keep from crying out loud as her neighbor quickly pushed her right up to the edge of what she knew she could comfortably handle in a spanking. She could already feel tears starting to well again at the corners of her eyes, making the hideously retro floral pattern occupying most of her vision swim and blur. And she had enough first-hand experience with being disciplined by her partner to know that she wouldn't be able to maintain her composure for very much longer now. "Yes, ma'am. I think I see what you mean." "Good," crooned Miss Hastings, lightly wrapping her slipper against each of her pale thighs as she shifted her aim to just below the undercurves of her cheeks. "I'm pleased to see that we're starting to get somewhere." That's one way of putting it. Wren began to grumble to herself, sniffling as she furtively wiped away her gathering tears on the back of her hand. "Thwop! Thwop! Aye!" Only to let out a high-pitched squeal of agony, furiously scissoring her legs back and forth behind her as the backs of her thighs were set ablaze by two more unforgiving smacks. I'm sorry, she babbled out all at once as fresh, hot tears began tracing their way down the sides of her face. "Yes, I imagine you are," agreed Mrs. Hastings rather smugly, delivering 4 more rapid-fire swats to the backs of the panting girl's thighs and really putting her back into it this time. "Thwop, thwop, thwop, thwop." "Oh, my God!" howled Wren, snatching up one of the throw pillows in front of her and burying her face in it to hide her embarrassment. "Starting to regret your bad behavior now, I take it," prompted Mrs. Hastings with an insistent tap, tap, tap of her slipper against the center of her still smoldering cheeks, giving her a chance to catch her breath before she continued on with the rest of her punishment. "Yes, ma'am," the thoroughly miserable younger girl mumbled into her pillow, though still loud enough to be heard despite its muffling. There was no way in heck she was going to give her a reason to tack on any more swats to her punishment. "Very good," chirped her elderly disciplinarian as she brought her slipper up to her shoulder and took aim once again. "We're just about halfway done, so try and be brave and take the rest of your punishment without too much of a fuss now, all right?" Rather than wait for her to reply, Mrs. Hastings instead let fly with another half-dozen savage swats. "Thwop, thwop, thwop! Thwop, thwop, thwop! Oh, owie! Ack, owie!" Which was just as well for Wren, as she was far too busy yelping and whining to have answered her anyway. "God dang it!" she cursed silently, squeezing her pillow for all it was worth as she floundered across the raised arm of her neighbor's couch, sniffling and squealing into its worn threading. I guess that's the end of Captain Wren's illustrious combat career. No more space battles for me. As soon as I get out of here, I'm retiring. If she hadn't known any better, Wren would have sworn that her bottom and thighs were actually smoking by the time Mrs. Hastings finished delivering the last of her slippering. For such a lean and seemingly frail old woman, her neighbor sure could swing a slipper like nobody's business. "Oh, there we are," she drawled contentedly, taking a couple steps back to survey her handiwork with a self-satisfied nod. "One well-smacked bottom and one thoroughly sorry little girl to go along with it. I'd say that's a job well done, wouldn't you?" "Yeah," Rhen had to admit, flashing her a wobbly, rueful grimace and laughing just a little before sniffling again and scrubbing a forearm across her watery eyes. "I think it's pretty safe to say that you made an impression. About 36 of them, to be exact," she added with a silent pout. Her round cheeks and narrow thighs had swollen considerably under her neighbor's implacable ministrations and were now painted a striking shade of dark pink, with an all-over stippling of darker carmine spots from where the textured grooves etched into the sole of the woman's slipper or shoe or whatever the heck it was had bitten into her unprotected hindquarters. It hadn't been the worst spanking she'd ever received, though it certainly must have been somewhere in the top 20 by her estimation, and coming as it was from someone who genuinely thought that she was a naughty 13-year-old girl who needed to be disciplined certainly made it exponentially more embarrassing for her. Regardless, Rhen knew that she'd definitely still be feeling nice and tender by the time she was tucked in for bed that night, even without the follow-up butt blistering that she was sure her partner still had in store for her. "Ugh," she groaned, her grimace giving way to a grudgingly impressed half-grin. "I don't think Aunt Dana could have done much better than that herself, actually. I'm definitely going to be sleeping on my stomach tonight. Humph!" Her over-the-top pouting caused one side of Mrs. Hastings' mouth to quirk up. "And just like that, the cheek returns," she snickered, drawing back in beside her and giving her well-roasted buns a couple of motherly pats. "What can I say?" snickered Rhen, right along with her as she reached back tentatively to try and knead away some of the lingering heat still radiating off of them in palpable waves with her good arm. "I bounce back fast." "Indeed you do," agreed her neighbor, the other side of her mouth joining its fellow to form an amused smile. "You must keep your poor auntie very busy." Feeling a bit loopy after her recent ordeal and riding high on a wave of endorphins from just having been so thoroughly treated like the naughty little girl people so often mistook her for, loving every second of it in spite of how humiliating it all was, Rhen couldn't help but blush even as she giggled again. "You have no idea." "Well," her neighbor finally declared after taking a moment or two to shake her head in bemusement at the sassy 20-year-old turned teenager that she'd just spanked like one of her own grandchildren, helping to ease her off of the elevated arm of her couch and back down onto her own 2 feet with a firm grip on her upper arms. "I just hope that I've at least managed to give you something to think about the next time you decide you want to ride your bicycle like some sort of loony." "Oh, you definitely have," Rhen quickly reassured her with an animated nod, her left hand still clamped tight over her aching caboose while she did her best to try and keep her hairless groin angled away and out of sight, in a rather belated attempt to preserve at least some small shred of her modesty. "In fact, I don't think I'll be in the mood to go riding for a while." "I suppose I'll consider this a job well done, then," teased her neighbor, lightly patting the central divide running down the middle of the "this" in question before taking hold of the hem of Wren's t-shirt. "All right, then. Now you just go ahead and raise your arms so that Nana Hastings can get you out of this shirt. since you're going to be here a while still, I might as well run your dirty clothes through the wash and save your auntie the trouble. They're positively filthy, you know." Stammered a suddenly far less sassy Rhen with an embarrassed gulp, going almost as red in the face as her bottom as she tried to sidestep out of her neighbor's grip, even as her t-shirt was pulled up to her armpits. The humiliating reality that she was perceived by most people as just another bratty teen in need of a healthy dose of mothering, reasserting itself with a vengeance and making her stomach twist and somersault. "That's really not necessary, ma'am." "Nonsense, child," clucked Mrs. Hastings with a shake of her head, following after her and giving the hem of her t-shirt a more insistent upward tug. "Now, quit your fussing and do as you're told. I'd rather not have to slipper you again, you know." "Ugh, fine." With an exasperated sigh and a truly impressive roll of her eyes that was thankfully obscured by her t-shirt as it was being pulled up over her head, Rhen allowed the old woman to finish stripping her down to just her thin, white camisole. "But I want extra marshmallows in my next cup of cocoa." That managed to draw an amused snort from Mrs. Hastings as she gathered up the rest of her confiscated bits of clothing, her eyes twinkling with amusement as they noted the totally hairless front of the pouting girl standing in front of her, with her arms folded beneath the minimal swell of her breasts. "I think that can definitely be arranged, my dear, though your auntie might be rather cross with you if you spoil your appetite before dinner, you know." Rhen just smirked at that, looking every inch the well-spanked, though good-natured brat that she was at heart. "I'm already in trouble as it is," she pointed out with an over-exaggerated harumph. "What's she going to do? Spank me?" Laughing now as she turned and began making her way toward the laundry room, her neighbor called back over her shoulder as she went, "That's an excellent point. In that case, you just go ahead and wait for me in the kitchen, and I'll be there in a bit, all right?" "Deal,"